I knew the aluminum ladder was giving way before I even felt myself falling, but nothing prepared me for the sound of my grandson laughing as I hit the concrete driveway. The October heat in Phoenix was brutal even at 8 a.m., and the metal rungs had been slippery with morning condensation that I should have noticed. Should have, but didn't, because at 68 years old, you sometimes forget that your body doesn't forgive mistakes the way it used to. The pain in my back was sharp and immediate, shooting down my spine like electricity. But the sting of that laughter cut deeper than any bruise ever could. For a moment I just lay there, work shirt torn at the shoulder, my old craftsman tools scattered around me like evidence of my failure. The Arizona sun beat down on Kenneth's driveway, already hot enough to fry an egg, and I could smell the rubber from my work boots mixing with the familiar scent of concrete dust and creosote from the desert. My name is Howard Mitchell, and I've been fixing things my whole life. 42 years in construction, from framing houses in Tucson to commercial projects all over the valley. I built half the subdivisions in Ahwatukee back in the 80s, when Phoenix was still growing faster than anyone could keep up with. These hands had laid foundation blocks in 115-degree heat and hung drywall in houses that would shelter 3 generations of families. But today, those same hands couldn't even hold on to a simple gutter repair ladder. "Grandpa, seriously?" Wesley's voice floated down from above me, bright and careless as desert sunshine. I looked up through the haze of pain and embarrassment, squinting against the glare. He stood over me with his iPhone raised, angling it like some kind of professional cinematographer, framing my humiliation like it was the funniest thing he'd ever witnessed. "Hold on, this is going viral for sure," he giggled, his thumb already working the screen. I didn't answer. At my age, silence is sometimes the only defense you have left against a world that seems to find entertainment in everything, especially other people's misfortune. I pushed myself up slowly, my joints protesting each movement, ignoring the fire that shot through my lower back and down into my right hip. The taste of dust and defeat filled my mouth. Wesley's laughter followed me as I limped toward Kenneth's house, the sound echoing off the stucco walls the way heat shimmers off asphalt in summer. Inside, everything was air-conditioned to Arctic levels and quiet as a tomb, that artificial stillness I'd grown used to since Dorothy died 3 years ago. The house smelled like vanilla candles and disappointment, nothing like the sawdust and coffee scent of the home we'd built together. Wesley shoved past me on his way through the front door, wiping tears of genuine amusement from his eyes. The kid was 18 now, legally an adult, but he moved through the world with the careless entitlement of someone who'd never had to work for anything he owned. "You should have seen your face, Grandpa," he said over his shoulder. "That was absolute gold. My followers are going to lose their minds over this." He didn't wait for a response. He never did. The boy I once taught to use a level, the kid who used to follow me around construction sites asking a million questions about everything from rebar to roofing tiles, now walked past me like I was just another piece of outdated equipment gathering dust in someone's garage. I lowered myself into Kenneth's leather recliner, the one I'd helped him pick out at that furniture store in Scottsdale when he first moved into this place. My fingers gripped the worn armrest until the ache in my back dulled enough for rational thought. The living room felt smaller than it used to, or maybe that was just me finally understanding how far children can drift from the men who helped shape them. Wesley clattered around the kitchen, humming some tune I didn't recognize, that careless rhythm that used to drive me crazy when he was little and clumsy. Back then, when he knocked over a glass of milk or tracked mud through the house, he'd look at me with those big brown eyes and say, "Sorry, Grandpa," and he meant it. The apology came from somewhere real. Now, his apologies were reserved for his online friends when his content didn't get enough engagement. The sound of the refrigerator opening and closing mixed with the hum of the oversized air conditioning unit that Kenneth had insisted on installing last year. Everything in this house was bigger than necessary, bought with money that hadn't come from his own labor. When Wesley's phone battery finally ran low enough to require his attention, I leaned forward to check my elbow where it had scraped against the concrete. The skin was torn in a jagged line, blood mixing with grit and forming a dark paste on my forearm. Nothing serious by construction worker standards, but at 68, even a small scrape feels like your body sending you a message about mortality that you're not quite ready to receive. I breathed slowly, evenly, the way the VA doctor had taught me after my last physical, when he'd noticed my blood pressure creeping up into dangerous territory. This wasn't my first fall on a job site, not by a long shot, In 42 years of construction work, I'd taken tumbles off scaffolding, slipped on wet concrete, even had a stack of drywall sheets knock me flat once. But those falls had happened among men who understood that accidents were part of the trade, men who'd help you up, dust you off, and get back to work without making it into entertainment. This fall was different. This one had an audience of one who thought my pain was content for his social media followers. When I heard Wesley's voice again, he was on a video call with his friends, his tone bright with the kind of excitement that comes from having something everyone wants to see. "Yeah, I got it all on camera," he said, pacing around the kitchen like he couldn't contain his energy. "No, seriously, he just went down like a tree in a windstorm. You should have heard the sound." Laughter erupted from his phone speaker, tinny and harsh through the small speakers. More laughter from him. They fed off each other like coyotes circling roadkill out in the Sonoran desert, each howl encouraging the pack. I stared at the family photographs arranged on Kenneth's mantelpiece, the expensive kind with professional matting and frames that probably cost more than I made in a week when I was starting out. Wesley at 8 years old, holding a fishing rod I'd bought him on a trip to Lake Pleasant. Wesley in his cap and gown at high school graduation just 3 months ago. Me standing beside him in that picture, holding flowers Dorothy and I had paid for, standing under the brutal June sun at the outdoor ceremony, sweat soaking through my good shirt. I'd spent years supporting that boy, years that seemed to blur together now like heat waves rising off summer asphalt. College tuition, $3,200 per semester that I'd transferred from my retirement account without hesitation. Books and supplies, another $800 each term. The truck he'd wanted for his 16th birthday, $387 a month for 18 months after he wrapped his first car around a mesquite tree on Shea Boulevard. Car insurance when the rates skyrocketed after the accident. Medical bills from his emergency room visit when he broke his wrist skateboarding in some empty swimming pool in Scottsdale. $2,400 that our family insurance wouldn't cover because it was classified as an extreme sport injury. I'd written the check the same day, grateful he was alive and whole. Nobody had filmed those moments of support. Kindness rarely makes for viral content. My back pulsed with a deep ache that seemed to spread with each heartbeat. I steadied myself against Kenneth's recliner, breathing slow and measured until the room stopped tilting at the edges. That boy hadn't even asked if I was hurt, hadn't shown the basic concern that any decent stranger would offer. The thought sat bitter in my mouth like the taste of dust and regret. When did simple human decency become optional? When did family stop meaning anything more than a convenient source of financial support? Wesley wandered back into the living room and leaned against the doorframe, chewing gum with the kind of aggressive casualness that teenagers mistake for confidence. His phone was still in his hand, always in his hand, like some kind of electronic appendage he couldn't function without. "Grandpa, don't be weird about it," he said, not quite looking at me directly. "It's just a video." "Is it?" I asked quietly, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes before storms roll across the desert. He rolled his eyes, a skill he'd perfected under his father's indulgent guidance and his mother Patricia's enabling. "Please, you're being dramatic." Dramatic. Funny how I'd said nothing dramatic at all. I'd barely said anything, period. But somehow my silence, my pain, my simple existence had become dramatic in his world. He disappeared back toward the kitchen, and I heard the familiar chime of notifications going off like casino slot machines. His friends responding to whatever fresh humiliation he'd shared with them, no doubt. My dignity spreading across Phoenix and beyond in little glowing rectangles, each notification another small cut. I sat there in Kenneth's air-conditioned silence long after Wesley had retreated upstairs to his room, listening to the faint thump of bass-heavy music through the ceiling. My back ached with the persistent pain of injured muscle and bruised pride, but something else hurt deeper. An old wound, the kind that grows quietly over years, watered by every small disrespect, every casual dismissal, every moment when you realize the people you love most see you as nothing more than a convenient resource. The Sonoran desert outside was coming alive with the day's heat, but inside this house everything felt cold as winter morning concrete. I thought about Kenneth then, about how he'd grown distant after Dorothy died, polite in that clipped way that means the affection has drained out and only obligation remains. He'd started treating our conversations like business meetings, checking his watch, glancing at his phone, always having somewhere more important to be. Of Patricia, his wife, who smiled too sweetly when she told me what I shouldn't worry about, her voice carrying that particular tone women use when they're managing someone they consider difficult. Of Wesley, who had inherited their indifference but sharpened it into something crueler, something that cut with the precision of youth who'd never learned that words and actions have weight. The house settled around me with small creaks and sighs, the way desert homes do when the temperature differential between inside and outside becomes extreme. Even the central air conditioning seemed to hum with a kind of distance, as if it too had decided to look the other way when family betrayed family. I eased myself up from Kenneth's recliner and walked toward the kitchen, moving carefully, testing each step. I wanted ice for my elbow, though mostly I wanted something cold to quiet the heat building under my skin like pressure in a boiler. The kitchen was all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, the kind of showcase setup that Kenneth and Patricia had insisted they needed when they bought this place. Money I'd helped provide through that $25,000 down payment, transferred from my retirement savings without a second thought because I wanted my son to feel secure, wanted my grandson to have a stable home. On the counter sat Wesley's empty glass, a smudge of energy drink residue around the rim, bright blue, artificial, like everything else in his life. I remembered when he was 14 and I'd tried to teach him how to frame a doorway in my garage workshop. He'd lasted maybe 20 minutes before declaring the work boring and wandering off to check his phone. That should have been my first warning. I wrapped some ice cubes in a dish towel and pressed the makeshift pack to my scraped elbow. The cold helped with the surface pain, but did nothing for the deeper ache spreading through my chest like cracks in old concrete. I stared at the small puddle of condensation forming on Kenneth's expensive granite, watching the droplets slide away like the years I'd spent believing things might somehow get better between us. When Wesley was young, really young, he'd loved coming to construction sites with me during summer breaks. He'd wear his miniature hard hat that Dorothy had found at a toy store and carry my level like it was the most important tool in the world. He'd ask endless questions about everything, why we used 2x4s instead of 2x6s, how we made sure walls were perfectly straight, what happened if we built something wrong. But Kenneth's influence, and Patricia's subtle corrections, had carved deep grooves in him over the years. Little remarks about my old-fashioned ways, my truck that burned oil and left stains on their pristine driveway, my clothes that carried the honest smell of sawdust and hard work. Comments made with careful smiles, but I've lived long enough to recognize the smile of people who build themselves up by tearing others down. Kenneth never defended me during those moments. He'd just sigh and tell me afterward, "Dad, don't take things so personally." But there's no other way to take disrespect except personally, especially when it comes from your own blood. I shifted the ice pack, wincing as my back protested the movement. I wasn't seriously injured, I knew that much from experience. I'd fallen worse plenty of times, back when I was younger and more resilient. But I'd never fallen in front of someone who found genuine entertainment in watching me struggle, someone who saw my pain as content for social media consumption. I moved to the sink and ran my hands under warm water, watching the last bits of concrete dust swirl down the drain. My reflection in the window above the sink caught my attention. Hair more gray than brown now, deep lines around my mouth that told the story of 68 years of desert sun and hard work, eyes that used to be sharp but today looked tired, defeated. "Get up," I murmured to myself, not talking about my physical position but about something deeper. Not just your body but everything else. It was an old habit from my construction days. When life knocked you down, you straightened your spine and your resolve before your heart had time to register the full damage. Upstairs, Wesley was laughing again, this time on what sounded like a group video call. My hearing wasn't what it used to be, but I could make out enough of his mocking tone to understand what was happening. "I swear to God," he went down like a sack of cement, his voice carried through the ceiling. "Yeah, I filmed the whole thing. Hold on, let me send it to the group chat." My throat tightened as the reality settled over me like dust after a demolition. The boy hadn't even waited an hour before turning my pain into entertainment for his social media circle. He was probably uploading it to TikTok, Instagram, maybe Snapchat too. I didn't understand all those platforms, but I understood humiliation spreading like wildfire across the digital desert. It's strange, the moments when your life splits into a before and an after. Not the loud moments, not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones, where someone shows you exactly who they've become. I walked slowly back toward the living room, each step deliberate, passing the hallway where family photographs lined the wall like a museum of better times. So many versions of Wesley smiled at me from those frames. Little hands holding mine at the Arizona Science Center. Birthday parties in this very house. Him blowing out candles on cakes that Dorothy and I had paid for. His high school graduation, when he'd hugged me tight and whispered, "Thanks, Grandpa. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Those words had warmed me through that entire blazing summer. Now they felt like lines from a play performed by an actor who no longer remembered his role, who'd moved on to a different production entirely. I reached the last picture at the end of the hallway, a photo of Dorothy and me on the day we'd closed on our first house. The one I'd built myself, working weekends and evenings after my regular job, every nail and board a testament to what a man could accomplish with determination and honest labor. She stood beside me, both of us younger, lighter, untouched by disappointments we couldn't have imagined then. "You'd have said something, Dot," I whispered to her image, pressing my fingers against the glass. "You'd have told him to stop, told him what respect looks like." She never tolerated disrespect from anyone, especially family. Dorothy had a backbone made of rebar and concrete, and she'd taught our kids that kindness wasn't weakness, that courtesy wasn't optional. Perhaps that was why missing her felt so sharp today, like reopening a wound that had just started to heal. I returned to Kenneth's leather recliner, settling into it with a grunt that reminded me of every one of my 68 years. The chair had cost more than my first truck, but it felt empty, cold despite the expensive leather. I should have been heading home to rest, maybe ice my back and take some ibuprofen. Instead, my mind kept replaying the fall, the laughter, the phone camera pointed at me like a weapon of mockery. I remembered the brief moment before I hit the concrete, when I'd thought Wesley might actually reach for me out of instinct, out of basic human decency. That split second when I believed family still meant something more than a convenient source of funding for whatever they wanted. But instinct toward compassion had left him long ago, replaced by the reflexive need to document everything for online consumption. And decency, well, that had never really taken root in soil that Kenneth and Patricia had made too rich with privilege and too poor with accountability. After what felt like hours, I heard Wesley's footsteps on the stairs again, that light bounce of youth unburdened by consequences or meaningful responsibility. He appeared in the doorway, phone still glued to his hand like a digital appendage, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who'd just gone viral at someone else's expense. "Grandpa," he said, leaning against the doorframe with theatrical casualness, "my friends want to know if you'll do more videos like that. Brandon says it's the funniest thing he's seen all month." I looked at him then. Really looked, not with the eyes of a grandfather remembering a sweet little boy, but with the clarity of a man finally seeing the young adult that boy had become. The gum chewing, the impatience radiating from every gesture, the dismissive curl of his lip that suggested my very existence was somehow inconvenient. A kid raised on comfort, funded by my labor, fed by my sacrifices, now genuinely amused by the man who'd helped him through every difficulty he'd never really had to face alone. "You should probably head home," he added with mock concern. "Old people bruise easier, right? Don't want you getting all stiff or whatever." Something inside me shifted then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, irreversible click, like the sound a level makes when the bubble finally finds center. Like the moment when you realize a foundation is cracked beyond repair and needs to be torn down and rebuilt. "Good night, Wesley," I said, my voice steady as a plumb line. He shrugged and headed back upstairs, leaving lights on, doors half open, the house in the same careless disarray he always did. But he left something else too, the clear understanding that whatever I had allowed for all these years had metastasized into something that was slowly killing what remained of my dignity. I sat there long after Wesley had disappeared upstairs, my hand resting on my scraped elbow, my breathing slow and deliberate as the desert evening settled over Phoenix like a heavy blanket. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the truth finally crystallized with the clarity of morning light hitting the Superstition Mountains. This wasn't the worst thing they'd done to me, it was just the first time I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. By morning, the bruise on my elbow had bloomed into an ugly purple flower against my weathered skin. I've had plenty of bruises over the years. 42 years in construction shapes you into someone who doesn't flinch at every ache or minor injury. But this one carried different weight, like a physical reminder of something that had broken inside me that had nothing to do with bones or muscle. I made coffee in my own kitchen back home, though the pot felt heavier than usual in my hands. The October morning light filtered through my windows, clean and bright the way desert light always is, cutting sharp shadows across the small table where Dorothy and I had shared breakfast for 38 years, where Wesley used to sit during summer visits, short legs dangling, asking me to tell him stories about the houses I'd built, the crews I'd worked with, the satisfaction of creating something solid that would last. Now he slept past noon and rarely looked up from his phone when we were in the same room. I was reading the Arizona Republic sports section, checking how the Suns had done in their preseason game, when my phone started buzzing like an angry rattlesnake. Notifications kept coming, one after another, faster than I could process them. At 68, smartphones still feel like demanding little creatures, always wanting attention for things that probably don't matter in the grand scheme of life. I set down my coffee and checked the screen, squinting at the small text. At the top was a message from my neighbor, Ted Morrison, a retired electrician I'd known for 15 years. Good man, built his own workshop in his backyard and kept his property neat as a pin. Howard, you okay? Saw the video on Facebook. That fall looked serious. Need any help around the house? My stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. I tapped the link Ted had sent, my fingers clumsy on the small screen, not quite believing what I was about to see. But there it was, clear as desert sky. My fall, my body hitting Kenneth's concrete driveway, Wesley's laughter echoing with crystal clarity. The video had been shot from above, making me look smaller, more fragile than I felt inside. Of course it had. Wesley hadn't intended kindness or dignity when he'd held up that phone. The angle made me look like exactly what his generation thought I was, just another old man who couldn't handle simple tasks anymore. His commentary was right there in the audio, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Gramps can't hang anymore, followed by that delighted laugh that cut through me like a skill saw through pine. The comments were already multiplying like weeds after summer rain, hundreds of them, growing by the minute, as more people discovered my humiliation and decided to add their voices to the chorus. LMAO, old dude went timber. Should have used a spotter, Gramps. That laugh is absolutely brutal. Boomer physics in action. Is he dead? Looks dead. Who films their grandpa falling? That's cold AF. That last comment stuck with me like a splinter under a thumbnail. Someone out there still had basic human decency, still understood that family meant something more than content creation. But Wesley apparently didn't see it that way, judging by his responses in the thread. He's fine, just dramatic LOL. Old people fall all the time. Family roast sessions hit different. I scrolled through more comments, not because I enjoyed the pain, but because part of me needed to understand exactly what my grandson had unleashed into the world. The video had been shared to multiple platforms: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, probably others I'd never heard of. My dignity spreading across the internet like oil across water, reaching people I'd never meet in places I'd never go. When Wesley's footsteps thundered down the stairs at Kenneth's house later that morning, I could hear them through my bedroom window since our houses shared a property line. I knew what was coming. I drove over in my old Ford pickup, the engine running rough but reliable like everything else I'd owned for the past 20 years. Wesley was practically bouncing with excitement when I walked through Kenneth's front door, his phone clutched in his hand like a winning lottery ticket. "Grandpa, the video hit 75,000 views overnight," Wesley announced as I stepped through the door, his voice carrying that particular excitement that comes from having something everyone wants to see. "Isn't that absolutely insane?" I didn't answer immediately. I stood there in Kenneth's air-conditioned entryway, taking in the sight of my grandson vibrating with energy over my humiliation. The contrast between his excitement and my growing anger was stark as the difference between Phoenix in summer and Phoenix in winter. "It's already on 4 different meme pages," he continued proudly, scrolling through his phone with the kind of focus he'd never shown for schoolwork or honest labor. "People are absolutely losing their minds over this. Brandon shared it to his story and got like 500 likes just for that." I turned slowly, letting myself really look at him. Not the boy he had been, but the young man he'd chosen to become. Self-satisfied, thoughtless, completely detached from any understanding of how his actions affected other people. 18 years old and already convinced that the world existed primarily for his entertainment. "Wesley," I said quietly, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes before desert storms roll in from the west. "Why would you post something like that?" He blinked at me, genuinely surprised that I wasn't joining his celebration. "It's funny, Grandpa. People post funny stuff all the time. That's literally how the internet works. Don't be so sensitive about it." Sensitive. There was that word again, the one people use when they don't want to admit they've caused real harm to someone they're supposed to care about. "You could have helped me," I said, each word measured and deliberate. "You could have checked if I was hurt." His jaw tightened with that particular teenage irritation, the kind they wear like armor when they know they're wrong but refuse to admit it. "I knew you were fine, Grandpa. You got up, didn't you?" "How did you know?" I asked. "I just knew," he muttered, looking away for the first time since I'd arrived. His eyes found his phone screen again, that digital security blanket that had replaced human connection in his world. He didn't know. He hadn't cared enough to know. I reached toward the phone in his hand, not to take it, just to try, to get his attention back on me instead of whatever notifications were lighting up his screen. "Wesley, I want you to take it down." He jerked his arm away like my touch burned. "No way. Everyone's already seen it anyway. It's not that big of a deal." Not that big of a deal. My pain, my injury, my dignity reduced to 4 words that dismissed everything I was feeling. Wesley stood there waiting for me to back down, to let it go the way I always had before. That's what everyone in this family had come to expect from me. Quiet acceptance, endless patience, unlimited forgiveness. "I'm asking you," I repeated, my voice steady as a foundation. "Take it down." "Grandpa," he said with an exasperated sigh that could have blown tumbleweeds across the Sonoran desert, "stop." "You're being dramatic again." The word again hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. How many times had he dismissed my feelings with that same tone? How many times had I swallowed it, telling myself he was just young, just going through phases, just echoing what he heard from Kenneth and Patricia? No, this wasn't a phase. This was a choice, a deliberate decision to treat my suffering as entertainment, to reduce me to a punchline for his online friends. I walked past him toward the kitchen, steadying myself on the granite countertop that I'd helped pay for, though not for balance, but to keep from saying something I might regret. My elbow throbbed where it had scraped against the concrete, but something deeper pulsed even louder. As I headed for the front door, Wesley called after me, his voice carrying that mock concern that teenagers use when they want to sound caring but can't quite manage genuine empathy. "Don't worry about it, Grandpa. You'll get used to it. People forget stuff online pretty quick anyway." But I wasn't worried, and I wasn't getting used to anything. And as I walked back to my truck, something Wesley had said echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. "Everyone's already seen it anyway." That was the point, wasn't it? This wasn't just about a fall, or even about a video. This was about the moment when private family business becomes public entertainment, when the people who are supposed to protect your dignity are the ones destroying it for likes and shares and the fleeting approval of strangers. I sat in my truck for a long moment before starting the engine, staring at Kenneth's house through the windshield. The house I'd helped him buy, where my grandson lived rent-free while attending community college on my dime, where my humiliation had been packaged and shipped out to the world like a product for consumption. Back home, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by tools that had fed my family for decades, and watched the afternoon light slant through the dusty windows that Dorothy used to clean every Saturday morning. The shop smelled like motor oil, sawdust, and decades of honest work. A scent that had always calmed me, but today felt like a reminder of everything I'd built, that was slowly being torn down by people who'd never lifted a finger to create anything themselves. My breathing was steady, controlled, but underneath it was a quiet storm gathering strength like the monsoons that roll across the valley every summer. This wasn't the first time Wesley had laughed at my expense, but it was the first time he'd invited the entire internet to laugh with him. And I finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. If I didn't stop this now, it would only get worse. Much worse. Sometimes the moment you hit bottom is the moment you finally decide to stand back up. And I was standing. By evening, I'd made up my mind about what needed to happen next. The house felt too small for the weight of everything pressing against my chest like concrete blocks in summer heat. I moved slowly through the rooms, not because of the pain in my elbow, though it still ached, but because every step seemed to echo with the same question that had been haunting me. How long have I allowed them to treat me this way? The answer was years, too many years to count, stretching back to when Wesley was still small enough to ride on my shoulders. I went to my home office, a small room at the back of the house that still carried the faint scent of Dorothy's lavender sachets even 3 years after her death. It was the only space Wesley never bothered with during his visits. There was nothing in it he wanted, nothing that could be turned into content for his social media feeds. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the drawer I'd been avoiding for months, and withdrew the thick manila folder I kept there. Financial records. Mitchell Family Support. Written on the tab in my own careful handwriting, the letters formed with the same precision I'd once used to mark measurements on building plans. I'd kept every receipt, every bank transfer confirmation, every canceled check. Dorothy had always said, paper remembers when people forget, and people had certainly forgotten plenty over the years. I opened the folder carefully on my desk, my weathered fingers tracing through documents I'd organized by year, each section telling its own story of generosity met with increasing indifference. The records went back 12 years, detailed documentation of exactly how much I'd invested in a family that now treated me like an inconvenience. Tuition bills for Wesley's college, $3,200 per semester for 4 semesters so far. I'd transferred the money from my retirement account without hesitation because Kenneth had said he needed time to get his landscaping business established. Car payments when Wesley had wrapped his first truck around that mesquite tree, $387 per month for 18 months. Medical bills from his emergency room visit, $2,400 that insurance classified as an extreme sports injury and refused to cover. Then the larger expenses, the ones that had really dug into my nest egg, the down payment on Kenneth's house when he'd said he wanted a place his son could be proud of, $25,000 transferred in a single wire that had taken 6 months out of my planned retirement. The credit card debt he and Patricia had accumulated during their rough patch, $8,500 that I'd paid off completely rather than watch them struggle with minimum payments and interest charges. The monthly support during the year Kenneth's landscaping business had failed, $200 per month for 8 months, while he figured things out and looked for steady work. Phone bills, car insurance premiums, textbook purchases, spring break trips, laptop repairs, a steady stream of financial requests that I'd honored without question because I thought that's what family did for each other. Line after line, amount after amount, each page more painful than the last. Not because of the money itself, but because of the trust and hope behind every transaction. All the times I'd believed my support would somehow bring us closer, that providing would remind them I was still a vital part of their lives. But the truth stared back at me from the paperwork with mathematical certainty. The more I gave, the less they valued me. The more I helped, the more they expected help as their natural right, rather than my generous choice. I came across a small yellow sticky note tucked between bank statements, a reminder I'd written to myself 3 years ago. He'll understand when he's older. I touched the faded ink with one finger, feeling the naive optimism of it pulse through my chest like an old injury. Wesley hadn't appreciated anything I'd done for him. He saw my help as an endless resource, something he could draw from without wondering who filled the well, who worked the extra hours, who sacrificed retirement dreams to fund his comfort and opportunities. Another page, another expense. Phone upgrades every time the latest model came out. Computer repairs when he'd downloaded something that crashed his hard drive. Spring break trips to places I'd never been able to afford when I was his age. Car insurance that cost more than my monthly grocery bill because of his accident record. When Dorothy died, I'd thought the saddest day of my life had passed. But I was learning there are other kinds of grief. Slow ones, quiet ones that grow with each dismissed phone call and each careless laugh until they hollow you out from the inside like termites eating through solid wood. I closed the folder carefully, smoothing the cover with my weathered hand. For the first time in years, these documents didn't represent burden or obligation. They represented evidence, proof, truth laid out in black and white with the kind of mathematical precision that couldn't be argued with or dismissed as being dramatic. And truth, I was beginning to understand, could be a powerful thing when spoken by a man who'd been quiet too long. As I set the folder aside, I heard Wesley's voice drifting through my bedroom window from Kenneth's house next door. Another video call, probably showing off someone else's misfortune for entertainment. The sound of his laughter carried across the narrow space between our homes like smoke from a fire you can't quite locate. I pressed my palm to my elbow where the bruise had spread into an ugly reminder of yesterday's humiliation. The fall replayed in my mind one more time, the ladder giving way, my body hitting the concrete, Wesley's immediate impulse to grab his phone instead of offering help. He'd filmed me like I was a stranger having a bad day on the street. Not family, not someone who'd spent decades trying to make his life easier and better, not someone who loved him despite his obvious flaws. I steadied myself with a deep breath, then another. Somewhere beneath all the humiliation and hurt, something I hadn't felt in years began to rise like groundwater after a good rain. Not anger exactly, not vengeance. Clarity. There was a time when my voice had carried weight in this family, when my hands were the ones that kept us fed, housed, and secure, when my support meant something other than a convenient ATM that never required a PIN or asked uncomfortable questions. If they had forgotten that, then it was time to remind them. Not through shouting. I was too old for shouting and too tired for family drama. Through honesty, through consequences, through the very thing they never expected me to reach for, my own dignity. The next morning I woke before sunrise with a clarity that had settled over me like clean desert air after a storm. I'd slept better than I had in months, probably because I'd finally stopped carrying the weight of other people's poor choices. I made coffee and sat by my kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the Superstition Mountains purple and gold. Phoenix in October is about as close to perfect as weather gets anywhere in the world, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself enjoy the simple pleasure of a quiet morning without dreading what the day might bring. I spent the early hours organizing the financial records, making copies of everything, arranging it all with the same attention to detail I'd once brought to construction estimates and job bids. Each document told its own story of generosity met with indifference, support answered with increasing disrespect. Around 9 a.m., I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I hadn't called in 3 years. Preston Gardner, attorney at law, a man about my age who'd helped me navigate Dorothy's estate after she passed. Straight shooter, no nonsense, the kind of lawyer who understood that working men don't have unlimited budgets or patience for fancy legal language. My finger hesitated only briefly before hitting call. He answered on the third ring. Howard Mitchell? Well, this is definitely a surprise. How you been holding up since Dorothy passed? Preston, I said quietly, my voice steady as a plumb line. I need some legal advice. His tone shifted, immediately becoming more focused, more professional. What's happened? I didn't tell him everything at once. When you've been hurt deeply, words come slowly, like doors opening in cold weather. I told him about the fall, Wesley's laughter, the video going viral, the years of financial support that had bought me nothing but contempt from people who should have been grateful. He didn't interrupt, just made small sounds that told me he was listening, really listening, the way lawyers do when they recognize a case that matters. When I finished explaining everything, Preston was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, the sound of a man processing information and calculating legal possibilities. Howard, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight I recognized from our meetings after Dorothy's funeral. Do you still have documentation of all the financial support you've provided? Every penny, I said, looking at the folder spread across my desk. 12 years of detailed records. And the video is still online? Far as I know, it's everywhere by now, different platforms, different accounts. Wesley made sure of that. That's actually good, Preston said gently. Not what happened to you, obviously, but that there's permanent evidence. Digital documentation is powerful in court. I closed my eyes, feeling something tight in my chest begin to loosen. I thought maybe I was overreacting, making too big a deal out of a family argument. You're not, he said firmly, and the certainty in his voice surprised me. In fact, Howard, you've been underreacting for years. This isn't just about a fall or even about a video. This is about financial exploitation, emotional abuse, and elder neglect. We can pursue all of that. The words hung in the air between us like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. Financial exploitation. emotional abuse, elder neglect. Terms I'd never applied to my own situation, but hearing them from someone who understood the law made something click into place with mechanical precision. The state of Arizona takes these cases very seriously, Preston continued, especially when there's clear documentation of both financial harm and public humiliation of an elderly person. My pulse quickened despite my efforts to stay calm. What about Kenneth? What happens to him in all this? That depends, Preston said carefully. If he knowingly allowed this behavior, if he participated in any way in the financial exploitation, he'll be included in the case. The law doesn't make exceptions for family relationships when it comes to elder abuse. I stared out my kitchen window at the desert landscape beyond, thinking about the little boy Kenneth used to be, the son I'd taught to use a tape measure and change a tire, who'd followed me around job sites asking intelligent questions about construction techniques. But I also thought about the man he'd become, someone who'd taught his own son that disrespecting his grandfather was acceptable behavior. I'm not trying to destroy their lives, Preston. I understand that, he replied. But Howard, you're not responsible for protecting people from the consequences of their own actions. You're trying to reclaim your dignity and secure your financial future. There's nothing wrong with that. For the first time since the fall, I felt my chest expand enough to take a full breath. The tightness that had been building there for months, maybe years, began to ease like a knot finally loosening. What happens next? I asked. Can you come into my office this afternoon? Bring all those financial records, and if you can get copies of the video and any online comments, that would help too. We'll review everything and discuss your options. I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me. I can be there by 2 p.m. Good, Preston said. Howard, I want you to understand something before we meet. What happened to you isn't minor. It isn't a family squabble that you should just get over. It's serious, and the legal system will treat it seriously. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, the morning light shifting across the table as Phoenix woke up around me. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the naive hope that things would magically get better, but the practical hope that comes from finally taking action instead of just enduring. I spent the rest of the morning preparing for the meeting with Preston. I made additional copies of all the financial documents, organized them chronologically, wrote out a timeline of events leading up to the fall. I screenshot Wesley's video and some of the worst comments, though doing so made my stomach turn. Around noon, I showered and put on my good clothes, the navy slacks and button-down shirt I usually reserve for church or important occasions. Looking in the mirror, I saw a man I hadn't seen in a while, someone who'd made a decision and was prepared to follow through on it. The drive to Preston's office took me through downtown Phoenix, past construction sites where crews were working in the desert heat, building the next wave of development that would change the valley's skyline. I'd been part of that transformation once, when my hands were steadier and my back was stronger. Now I was building something different, a case for my own dignity. Preston's office sat across from the Maricopa County Superior Court, a reminder that justice was closer than I'd thought, waiting for people brave enough to ask for it. Preston's office hadn't changed much in the 3 years since I'd last been there. Same oak furniture, same framed law degrees on the walls, same view of the courthouse across the street where justice waited for people willing to ask for it. When I walked in carrying my folder of evidence, he stood from behind his desk with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent decades helping people navigate their worst moments. "Howard," he said, extending his hand, "you look determined." "That's good." I settled into the chair across from his desk, the folder heavy on my lap like a weight I was finally ready to set down. "I've been thinking about this all night, Preston, about what they've done, what I've allowed. I can't let it continue." He nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Before we dive into the details, I want you to understand something. What happened to you is serious. Arizona law specifically protects elderly people from this kind of treatment, and we have strong grounds for both financial recovery and damages." I opened the folder and slid it across his desk. "There's more in here than just money, but that's a big part of it." Preston leafed through the document slowly, his expression growing more serious with each page. Bank transfers, receipt copies, loan agreements, payment confirmations. 12 years of my financial life reduced to paper, but paper that told an undeniable story. Jesus, Howard, he said quietly, then caught himself. Pardon the language. How much total support are we talking about here? I'd done the math 3 times to be sure. Just over $78,000 over the past 12 years. That's documented support. There were probably smaller amounts I didn't track. He whistled low. And they've never repaid any of it? Never asked them to. Thought that's what family was supposed to do. Family helps family, Preston agreed. Family doesn't exploit family. He closed the folder carefully. Howard, this is textbook financial exploitation of an elderly person. Combined with the video evidence, we have an extremely strong case. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, not from fear, but from the relief of finally being heard by someone who understood the legal weight of what had happened to me. Show me the video, he said. I pulled out my phone and played the clip that had haunted me for days. In the quiet of his office, Wesley's laughter sounded even more cruel, more deliberate. Preston watched without expression until it ended, then sat back in his chair. That's damaging evidence, he said simply. Failure to render aid to an elderly person in distress, public humiliation, emotional abuse. Any judge who sees that will understand exactly what we're dealing with. The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Within a week, Kenneth and Wesley were served with papers at their house. I watched from my kitchen window as the deputy sheriff knocked on their door, knowing that everything was about to change between us, forever. 2 weeks later, we sat in a conference room at the courthouse, Kenneth and Wesley on one side with their lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. Preston and me on the other side, with evidence that spoke louder than any argument. The mediator was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and no patience for excuses. She'd watched Wesley's video twice, the second time pausing it at the moment his laughter was loudest. Mr. Mitchell, she said to Wesley, can you explain why you thought this was appropriate? Wesley looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, the confidence that came so naturally when he was behind a phone camera nowhere to be found. I didn't think it was that serious, he mumbled. You didn't think a 68-year-old man falling from a ladder was serious? She asked. I thought he was okay. Did you check? Did you offer assistance? Silence. The settlement was fair and comprehensive. Wesley would complete 200 hours of community service working with elderly residents at a local assisted living facility, plus complete an online course about digital responsibility and elder respect. Kenneth would repay $30,000 over 5 years through automatic payroll deduction, with the balance forgiven if payments were made on time. More importantly, both were barred from my property without written permission, and any future financial support would require legal documentation. As we left the courthouse, Wesley caught up to me in the parking lot. Grandpa, he said, his voice small and uncertain, I really am sorry. I didn't understand. I stopped and turned to look at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the calm that comes from standing up for yourself. Wesley, I said, sorry is where change begins, not where it ends. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. The bruise on my elbow had faded to almost nothing, but the lesson it taught would last the rest of my life. Sometimes the people we love most need to learn that love isn't a license to hurt. Sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it first. And sometimes an old man's dignity is worth fighting for, even when the fight comes later than it should have. I was 68 years old, and I was finally learning that respect isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you defend every day for as long as you're breathing.